There are defeats that ring louder in history than the greatest of victories, and there are silences on the battlefield more terrifying than the thunder of artillery. On the morning of November the 14th, 1854, the British Army in the Crimea did not wake to the sound of Russian bules or the rattle of musketry, but to a screaming wind that would tear the very heart out of the expedition. If you possess a hunger for the forgotten truths of our past, for the stories of men who stood against impossible odds not with a sword but with a conscience, I invite you to subscribe to the channel and join us as we uncover the history that the official ledgers tried to bury. To understand the scale of the catastrophe that befell Her Majesty's forces, one must first strip away the romantic paintings of the era. Forget the pristine scarlet tunics and the polished brass of the parade ground. By the winter of 1854, the army that had marched so proudly to the Alma was a specter of its former self. They were camped on a bleak, windswept plateau above the port of Balaclava, engaged in the siege of Sevastopol. They had been promised a swift victory, a short campaign that would see them home by Christmas with medals on their chests and stories for the tavern. Little did they know, the true enemy was not behind the stone walls of the Russian fortress. The true enemy was gathering its strength in the darkening skies above the Black Sea. The great hurricane, as it would come to be known, struck with a ferocity that veteran sailors declared they had never witnessed in all their years at sea. On land, the devastation was absolute. Tents were ripped from their pegs and sent spiraling into the gray void, leaving thousands of men exposed to the freezing rain and biting sleet. The hospital marquees, filled with the sick and the wounded, collapsed upon their occupants, turning places of refuge into muddy tombs. Officers and privates alike were reduced to crawling on their hands and knees through a quagmire of clay and slush, unable to stand against the gale that battered the heights. But the true tragedy, the blow that would doom the army to a winter of medieval misery, took place at sea. Outside the harbor, the pride of the transport fleet, a magnificent steamship named the Prince, fought a losing battle against the waves. She was not a warship. She carried no cannons to threaten the Tsar. She carried something far more precious. In her hold sat 40,000 winter greatcoats, boots, blankets, and vast quantities of medical supplies intended to keep the expeditionary force alive. When the Prince was dashed against the jagged rocks of the Crimean coast, she took with her the army's lifeline. In a single hour, the warm clothing for 40,000 men vanished beneath the waves. The consequences of this singular event were not immediately felt in London, where gentlemen sat by roaring fires discussing the progress of the war over port and cigars. But on the heights of Balaclava, the impact was immediate and horrifying. The temperature began to plummet, the rain turned to snow. The men, now lacking tents, blankets, and greatcoats, stood shivering in uniforms that were rotting off their backs. They wrapped their feet in sandbags and hay, their boots having long since disintegrated in the suction of the mud. It is here, in this landscape of despair, that we must pause to consider the peculiar madness of the Victorian military machine. One might assume that a nation as wealthy and industrialized as Britain would move heaven and earth to replace what was lost. One might expect a flurry of emergency requisitions, a discarding of protocol to save the lives of the Queen's soldiers. But the British Army of the mid-19th century was not an engine of efficiency. It was a creature of rigid, unyielding bureaucracy. The Commissariat Department, the body responsible for feeding and clothing the troops, operated under a system of checks and balances designed for peacetime accounting, not the exigencies of a desperate winter campaign. A request for firewood required 7 separate signatures. A requisition for coffee which arrived, bafflingly, as unroasted green beans could be denied because the requesting officer had used the wrong shade of ink or failed to indent the margin correctly. While men froze to death in the trenches, their bodies stiffening in the rime of the morning frost, the storehouses in Balaclava remained locked. Not empty, but locked. This is the cruelty of the situation that confronts us. There were supplies. There were blankets piled high in the bonded warehouses of the port. There were barrels of salt pork and crates of lime juice. But they were bound in chains stronger than steel. They were bound in red tape. The junior officers, terrified of the rebuke they would receive for unauthorized distribution, stood guard over piles of clothing while the infantry regiments died of exposure a mere mile away. They feared the anger of the Treasury more than the judgment of the Almighty. It was a failure of imagination as much as a failure of logistics. The generals, old men who had learned their trade under the Duke of Wellington 40 years prior, could not conceive of a war where the quartermaster was as vital as the cavalry. They believed that British pluck and discipline would serve as a substitute for caloric intake and thermal insulation. They were wrong. As December approached, the army began to die, not in the glory of the charge, but in the quiet, ignoble squalor of dysentery and hypothermia. The thin red line had turned gray with sickness. The camp was silent, save for the coughing of the sick and the dull thud of spades digging shallow graves in the frozen earth. Hope had evaporated like breath in the cold air. But in a small, candle-lit tent near the harbor amidst the chaos of the administrative section, one man sat staring at a ledger. He was not a lord, nor a general. He was a man of the middle classes, a clerk in uniform, a quartermaster whose entire life had been dedicated to the precise counting of inventory. He looked at the columns of figures, the neat handwriting that tallied the stockpiles of the empire. Then he looked out at the spectral figures of the soldiers limping past his tent, their eyes hollow, their feet bound in rags. He looked back at the paperwork, the requisition forms that had been returned to him, stamped denied for trivial irregularities. In that moment, the clerk felt a shift in the tectonic plates of his own morality. He realized that the ink on the page was worth more to his superiors than the blood of the men outside. He picked up his pen, dipped it into the inkwell, and hovered the nib over the paper. He knew the regulations. He knew the penalty for falsifying His Majesty's records. It was court-martial, disgrace, perhaps even hanging for theft of government property. The wind howled outside, rattling the canvas, screaming like the ghosts of the unburied dead. The clerk took a breath, steadied his hand, and for the first time in his life he prepared to lie, to comprehend the solitary rebellion of a humble quartermaster in a freezing tent. One must first cast one's gaze far beyond the muddy plateau of the Crimea, back across the turbulent waters of the Mediterranean, to the very heart of the 19th century world. The disaster that was unfolding on the Black Sea coast was not merely a misfortune of weather, it was the inevitable mathematical result of a grand geopolitical gamble that had gone terribly wrong. The year 1854 found Europe balancing on a knife edge. For 4 decades, since the guns had fallen silent at Waterloo, the continent had enjoyed a fragile peace. But to the east, the Russian bear was stirring. The Tsar, Nicholas I, looked upon the crumbling Ottoman Empire, the so-called sick man of Europe, with a predatory gaze, seeking to expand his dominion down to the warm waters of the Mediterranean. To the British establishment, this was not merely a territorial dispute, it was an existential threat. If Russia controlled the Dardanelles, the route to India, the jewel in the imperial crown, would be severed. And so, swept up in a fever of jingoism and righteous indignation, Britain decided to act. The newspapers cried out for war, the public filled the streets waving the Union Jack, and the politicians in Westminster spoke of a swift, decisive lesson to be taught to the autocrat in St. Petersburg. They dispatched an expeditionary force, the finest the nation could muster, to invade the Crimea and capture the great naval fortress of Sevastopol. It was a venture born of hubris. The army that sailed east was, to the eye of the romantic observer, a magnificent spectacle. It was a kaleidoscope of color, the scarlet of the guards, the rifle green of the skirmishers, the pristine white breeches of the cavalry. But beneath this glittering surface lay a rot that had been festering for 40 years. This was an army preserved in the amber of its own past glory. It was the army of the Duke of Wellington, frozen in time, commanded by men who believed that the tactics of 1815 were eternal truths. The officer class was a closed circle of aristocracy, where rank was not earned by merit or competence, but purchased with gold. A man became a lieutenant colonel not because he understood logistics or strategy, but because his father had the thousands of pounds required to buy the commission. These were brave men, certainly gallant to a fault, willing to walk into cannon fire without blinking, but they viewed the scientific management of war as something beneath a gentleman. To worry about fodder, transport wagons, and caloric intake was the work of tradesmen, not warriors. Consequently, the British Army possessed no baggage train. It had no organized ambulance corps. It had no professional system of supply. It marched to war assuming that the locals would provide wagons, or that victory would be so swift that logistics would be unnecessary. But if the generals were negligent, the true villain of our story was not a soldier at all. The true villain sat in a warm office in London, wielding a weapon far deadlier than a Russian bayonet, the ledger. The supply of the army was the responsibility of the Commissariat Department. It is crucial to understand that the Commissariat was not, strictly speaking, a military body. It was a department of the Treasury. Its officers were not soldiers, they were civil servants. Their primary mandate was not to win battles, but to save money. They were the watchdogs of the public purse, trained to view every expenditure with deep suspicion. To a commissariat officer, a request for extra blankets was not a cry for help. It was a potential instance of fraud to be investigated. The system they administered was a labyrinth of Kafkaesque complexity, designed to strangle initiative. We find records of the era detailing the absurdity of their protocols. To issue a single cord of firewood to a freezing regiment required a requisition form signed by the quartermaster, countersigned by the colonel, approved by the brigadier, and then stamped by the commissariat, a process involving 7 distinct signatures. If a single signature was illegible or placed in the wrong box, the form was returned, and the wood remained locked away while the men shivered. This parsimony was not malice, it was policy. The British government, terrified of the cost of a continental war, had slashed the military infrastructure to the bone during the years of peace. They sent 25,000 men to invade a hostile superpower, yet provided them with fewer transport animals than a medium-sized commercial brewery. When the army landed in the Crimea in September, the sun was shining. The harvest was in. The country seemed pleasant, almost welcoming. The victory at the River Alma, where the British infantry stormed the heights with impeccable discipline, confirmed the general's belief that this would be a short adventure. "We shall be in Sevastopol in a week," they boasted. Little did they know that the siege would not last a week. It would last a year. As the weeks dragged on and the leaves began to turn, the fatal flaw in the plan revealed itself. The army had marched to the uplands surrounding Sevastopol, leaving their supply base at the port of Balaclava, 6 miles to the rear. Between the port and the camp lay a dirt track. As the autumn rains began, that track dissolved. It transformed into a sticky, voracious clay that sucked the shoes off horses and the boots off men. Without a dedicated transport corps, the army relied on the few animals they had brought with them. But the horses, starved of hay because the commissariat had deemed shipping bulky forage uneconomical, began to die. They died in the mud, their ribs showing through their coats, until the route from the port was lined with the carcasses of the very beasts needed to save the army. By November, the lifeline was broken. The supplies were sitting in Balaclava, mountains of food, clothing, and medicine arriving from England, but they might as well have been on the moon. There was no way to move them the 6 miles to the front. The soldiers, starving and freezing, were forced to trudge down from the heights, wade through the mud to the port, carry a sack of biscuits or a cannonball on their backs, and climb back up. It was a journey that killed the weak and exhausted the strong. The Treasury had saved money on hay. The cost was the destruction of the cavalry. They had saved money on wagons. The cost was the starvation of the infantry. Thus, the stage was set for the tragedy. The global powers had locked horns, sending armies into the void. The aristocratic generals had marched their men into a trap of geography, and the bureaucrats in London had bound the hands of the only people who could help. The system was functioning exactly as it was designed to function. It was saving pounds and shillings, while spending lives with reckless abandon. It was a machine built to fail, a perfect storm of incompetence and indifference. There was no room in this rigid structure for a man who cared more for human suffering than for the rules. There was no place for a rogue element. But back in that candlelit tent, as the ink dried on a forged signature, the clerk was about to demonstrate that even the most formidable machine can be broken by a single small cog that refuses to turn. He was about to declare a private war against the Treasury, unaware that his first act of defiance was merely the opening skirmish of a battle that would consume his soul. To find the hero of our story, one would have to look past the gold braid of the general staff, past the dashing cavalry officers with their whiskers and their wolfskin pelisses, and descend into the murky candlelit world of the administrative rearguard. History usually reserves its statues for the men who wield the saber. But the man who would save the British army in the Crimea wielded nothing more lethal than a steel-nibbed dip pen. He was the quartermaster. Let us call him by his title, for in the rigid hierarchy of the Victorian army, his rank was his identity. He was a man of the middle station, perhaps the son of a draper or a commercial clerk from Manchester, born into a world of double-entried bookkeeping and inventory manifests. In a military society obsessed with breeding and bloodlines, he was invisible. To the aristocrats who commanded the regiments, he was a necessary utility, like a water pump or a latrine, to be used and ignored in equal measure. He did not look like a hero. He was likely a man of slight build, his uniform ill-fitting compared to the tailored splendor of the officers, his fingers permanently stained with the black gall ink of his trade. While the young lieutenants spent their evenings gambling and debating the merits of fox hunting, the quartermaster spent his nights in communion with the ledger. But to mistake his lack of martial glamour for a lack of courage would be a fatal error. For this was a man possessed of a ferocious competence. He viewed the world not through the lens of glory, but through the lens of mathematics. Where a general saw a brigade of gallant soldiers, the quartermaster saw a caloric equation: 2,000 men required 3,000 pounds of bread, 1,000 pounds of meat, and 200 gallons of rum per diem. He knew the precise tensile strength of a canvas tent and the rate at which leather rotted in wet conditions. He understood, with a clarity that escaped his superiors, that an army is a biological machine. If you stop feeding the machine stops fighting. His mind was a catalogue of the Empire's resources. He knew where the biscuits were baked in Deptford. He knew the shipping times from Portsmouth to Constantinople to the hour. He was rigid, pedantic, and utterly humorless about his work. In peacetime, he was the bane of the lazy soldier, the man who would dock a private's pay for a missing button or a lost spoon. He was a creature of rules. However, there was a fire burning beneath that grey exterior. It was a fire kindled years before, perhaps on a previous posting in the furnace of India or the fever swamps of the West Indies. He had seen what happens when the supply chain breaks. He had watched good men he had shared rations with wither away because a shipment of quinine was delayed or a water cask had leaked. He carried the ghosts of those failures in the back of his mind. He had sworn a silent oath to the ledger that, under his watch, the numbers would always balance. When the army arrived in the Crimea, the quartermaster was the first to smell the coming rot. While the generals were congratulating themselves on the victory at the Alma, he was walking the supply lines. He was checking the axles of the wagons, noting the dry rot in the wood. He was inspecting the biscuits, finding the telltale weevils that turned hardtack into dust. He saw the fragility of the entire enterprise. We can imagine him in those early days of October, standing on the bustling quayside of Balaclava. The port was a hive of chaotic activity ships unloading cannonballs, officers shouting orders, horses kicking and screaming. But amidst the noise, the quartermaster stood still, his notebook in hand. He was doing the sums. He calculated the distance to the front lines, 6 miles uphill. He counted the number of pack animals available. He looked at the darkening sky, feeling the drop in barometric pressure that heralded the winter. He did the math, and the math terrified him. He tried to warn them. There are fragments of correspondence from this period, dry, formal letters sent up the chain of command. Sir, I have the honor to submit that the current stock of forage is insufficient for the coming month. Sir, I respectfully request the immediate requisition of winter clothing. These warnings were met with the deafening silence of the bureaucracy, or worse, with derision. Who was this clerk to lecture a knight of the realm on the conduct of a campaign? He was told to mind his books and leave the strategy to his betters. One can picture the humiliation, the stinging rebuke from a young, arrogant aide-de-camp who had never known a day of hunger in his life. The quartermaster would have swallowed his anger, clicked his heels, and returned to his tent. But as the days grew shorter and the rain began to fall, the quartermaster's pedantry transformed into a desperate vigil. He began to hoard. He became miserly with the few supplies he had, earning the hatred of the soldiers who did not understand that he was trying to stretch 3 days' rations into 7. He was fighting a war of attrition against his own depletion rates. It is a peculiar tragedy of his position that he was surrounded by the very things that could save the army, yet was powerless to use them. He sat in a warehouse surrounded by crates, but the crates were sealed with the wax of the Commissariat. To break a seal without a direct order was a court-martial offense. He was a priest in a temple of plenty, watching his congregation starve outside the doors. Deep down, the quartermaster was a believer in the system. He believed that if he filled out the forms correctly, if he followed the procedures, the machine would work. He had faith in the rationality of the British Empire. Little did he know that faith was about to be shattered. The turning point was not a dramatic explosion, but a quiet moment of horror. It likely happened during a routine inspection of the hospital tents. He would have gone there to audit the consumption of medical spirits. What he found was not a hospital, but a charnel house. Men with dysentery lying in their own filth on the bare ground. Amputees shivering violently as the frost crept into their wounds. He saw the faces of the men he was supposed to support, faces that looked like skulls wrapped in parchment. And then he saw an officer, a commissariat official from London, refuse a surgeon a bottle of port for a dying man because the surgeon had not filed the correct requisition slip in triplicate. The quartermaster watched the man die. He watched the official tuck his ledger under his arm and walk away, satisfied that he had protected the Treasury's wine. In that moment, something in the quartermaster broke, or perhaps something was forged. The rigidity that had defined his life, the obsession with rules and order, suddenly inverted. He realized that the rules were not keeping the army alive. The rules were the weapon that was killing them. The enemy was not just the Russian winter, it was the man with the ledger. He returned to his tent that night, the screams of the hospital still ringing in his ears. He looked at his own ledger, the book that had been his Bible. He dipped his pen in the ink. But this time, he did not record the truth. This time, he looked at a column of figures representing blankets that did not exist, and he made a decision. He would no longer be a servant of the Treasury. He would become a thief for the infantry. The man who had spent a lifetime ensuring that every penny was accounted for was about to embark on the greatest embezzlement in military history. He was about to declare war on his own government, armed only with a stack of blank forms and a talent for forgery. Victory, in the British imagination, is often painted in the primary colors of a military print: the vivid red of the tunic, the brilliant white of the smoke, and the deep blue of the summer sky. Following the Battle of the Alma in September of 1854, this illusion seemed entirely intact. The British army had stormed the Russian heights, driven the Tsar's forces into a panicked retreat, and stood masters of the field. The mood in the camp was one of intoxicated optimism. Officers wrote home to their wives in London, promising to be back in time for the pheasant shooting season, joking that the war was all but won. Little did they know they had just marched through the gates of hell, and the door was about to be bolted behind them. The strategic decision was made to march around the city of Sevastopol and lay siege to it from the south, establishing a supply base in the small, deep water port of Balaclava. On paper, in the warm, candlelit map rooms of the generals, this plan was sound. It was classical warfare. But the map is not the territory. As the army settled onto the Chersonese upland, a high exposed plateau of limestone and clay, the trap began to set. The distance from the port of Balaclava to the trenches was a mere 6 miles. In a decent English autumn, a man could walk it in 2 hours. A horse and cart could make the round trip twice a day. But the Crimea was not England. As October bled into November, the rains arrived. They did not fall as gentle showers, but as a relentless, soaking deluge that transformed the geography itself. The soil of the plateau, a deceptive chalky clay, drank the water and turned into a substance of nightmarish consistency. It was a morass that defied description, a thick, clinging glue that could pull the shoe off a horse or hold a wagon wheel in a grip of iron. The British Army had brought no organized transport corps, relying instead on a motley collection of ponies purchased in Turkey and heavy cavalry chargers drafted into draft work. But the Treasury, in its infinite wisdom, had decided that shipping hay from England was too expensive. They assumed the horses could graze on the local steppe grass, but the grass was gone, trampled into the mud by thousands of boots. The horses began to starve. The clerk watched with a growing sense of dread as the arithmetic of death took hold. A horse needs 20 pounds of forage a day to work. Without it, the animal weakens. A weak horse cannot pull a wagon through 2 feet of clay. The wagon gets stuck. The supplies, the biscuits, the salt pork, the ammunition do not reach the front. The men on the heights, starving and weak, cannot march down to carry the supplies themselves. It was a spiral of catastrophe. The clerk submitted urgent requisitions for pressed hay. He pointed out, with the dry precision of his trade, that without fodder, the transport system would cease to exist within 14 days. His request was returned. The indentation on the left margin was incorrect. The form was obsolete. And besides, the commissariat officer noted in the margin, local purchase is preferred for reasons of economy. The word hung over the dying army like a shroud. The most harrowing symbol of this bureaucratic madness was the affair of the green coffee. The Treasury, seeking to save a fraction of a penny per pound, had shipped the army's coffee ration in the form of raw, unroasted green beans. To make this coffee drinkable, the beans had to be roasted and then ground. Picture, if you will, the soldier in the trenches. He has no firewood, for there are no trees on the plateau, and the roots have long since been dug up for fuel. He has no grinder, for none were issued. He is freezing, wet to the bone, and holding a handful of rock-hard green beans. In desperation, men tried to crush them between stones in the mud, boiling the fragments in mess tins over fires made of dried dung. The result was a vile, bitter sludge that did not comfort, but sickened. He felt the rising bile of a man who sees murder being committed by negligence. He attempted to circumvent the blockage. He tried to issue rum, a vital source of warmth and calories, ahead of schedule. He was stopped by a senior officer who reminded him that regulations strictly prohibited the issuing of spirits without a specific medical certificate or the presence of an officer of field rank. The rum stayed in the barrel. The men stayed in the cold. The system cared nothing for the reality of war. It cared only for the integrity of the process. And then the snow began to fall. It started as a few flakes, dancing in the wind, settling on the shoulders of the sentries. But it was the herald of the Russian winter. The temperature plunged. The mud froze into jagged ruts that cut boots to ribbons. The men, still wearing their summer uniforms, their greatcoats worn threadbare or lost in the hurricane, looked at the sky with the hollow eyes of the condemned. The clerk stood at the flap of his tent, his breath pluming in the icy air. He held a returned requisition form in his hand, another refusal, another demand for proper procedure. He looked up at the hills, where the campfires were few and far between, flickering like dying stars. He knew what was coming. The road was gone. The horses were dead. The system had failed. The army was effectively cut off from the world, stranded on a frozen rock, abandoned by the country that had sent it there. The clerk crushed the paper in his hand, the stiff parchment crumpling with a dry crack. The time for asking was over. The time for taking had begun. By December of 1854, the Crimea had ceased to be a battlefield in the conventional sense. It had become a vast, open-air prison of ice and clay, where 25,000 British subjects were held captive by the incompetence of their own government. The roar of the artillery had largely fallen silent, for the gunners were too weak to haul the ammunition through the mire. The clash of sabers had been replaced by the dull, rhythmic hacking of the grave diggers' spades in the frozen earth. But amidst this landscape of frozen purgatory, there was one place where the war was still being fought with frantic, fanatical energy: the administrative offices of the Commissariat Department. Here, the enemy was not the Russian, but the irregularity. Here, the ammunition was not grape shot, but ink. The order of silence had descended upon the camp. It was a terrifying phenomenon noted by many survivors. The men had stopped complaining. They had stopped singing around the campfires, for there was no wood for fires. They had even stopped groaning in their sleep. They simply lay down in the mud, wrapped in their sodden, threadbare blankets, and drifted into the final sleep of hypothermia. It was a silence of resignation, a collective acceptance that they had been sent here to die. Our clerk, however, refused to be silent. We find him in the first week of December, standing before the desk of a senior commissary officer. Let us call him the chief of logistics. The contrast between the two men could not have been more stark. The clerk was gaunt, his uniform hanging loosely on his frame, his boots wrapped in burlap sacks to keep out the wet. The chief, by comparison, sat in a requisitioned house near the harbor, warmed by a coal stove, wearing a clean, dry tunic. The clerk had come to beg, not for himself, but for the 4th Division, who were reportedly eating their pack ponies to survive. He held a requisition for charcoal and blankets, items that were sitting in the hold of a ship in the harbor, visible through the window of the very office in which they stood. The dialogue of this encounter, reconstructed from the furious diary entries of the era, stands as a monument to bureaucratic insanity. The chief did not deny that the men were dying. He did not deny that the charcoal was available. He simply pointed to the regulations. "The Board of Survey has not yet convened to inventory the shipment," he explained with the patient tone of a schoolmaster addressing a slow child. "Until the board has counted the sacks and verified the weight against the manifest, the cargo is technically not His Majesty's property. To issue it would be theft." "But men are freezing, sir," the clerk insisted, his voice trembling with a mixture of cold and rage. "They will be dead before the board convenes." The chief dipped his pen in the inkwell and returned to his ledger. "The regulations," he said without looking up, "were written by the Lords of the Treasury. They are not subject to the weather. Good day, Quartermaster." Humiliated, dismissed, and powerless, the clerk left the warmth of the office and stepped back into the biting wind. But he did not return to his tent. Instead, driven by a morbid compulsion to witness the cost of this pedantry, he turned his steps toward the general hospital. If the camp was purgatory, the hospital was hell. It was a collection of leaking marquees pitched in a sea of mud. There were no beds. The sick and wounded lay on the bare earth, packed so tightly that when one man turned, the whole row had to turn with him. The smell was a physical blow, a miasma of gangrene, dysentery, and unwashed bodies that clung to the back of the throat. The clerk walked down the rows of the dying. He saw men he recognized, veterans of the Alma, giants of men who had once stormed the Russian guns, now reduced to skeletons, weeping like children for a drop of water. He saw a young drummer boy, no older than 16, trying to warm his frostbitten hands on the stomach of a corpse that had not yet been removed. It was here, in this cathedral of suffering, that the clerk's faith in the British way finally died. He realized that the silence of these men was not nobility. It was an accusation. They were dying because a man in a warm room was worried about a column of figures. They were being murdered by the ledger. He stumbled out of the hospital tent, gasping for clean air, his mind reeling with the horror of it. He began to walk aimlessly through the port, past the chaotic piles of stores that had been dumped on the quayside, and then he stopped. He found himself standing in front of a long, wooden warehouse known as Bonded Store No. 4. The door was secured with a heavy iron padlock, sealed with the red wax of the commissariat. Through the gaps in the wooden slatting, the clerk could see inside. The warehouse was not empty. It was packed to the rafters. There were crates of winter boots, piles of thick woolen grego coats, and bales of blankets. He stood there, separated from the salvation of the army by 2 inches of pine and a padlock. He knew why the door was locked. The paperwork had not arrived from London. The proper channels had not been navigated. The forms of issue had not been signed in triplicate by the divisional commander, who was currently 6 miles away and likely delirious with fever. The supplies were there. The need was there. The only thing standing in the way was a rule. A sentry walked past, shivering in the cold, his musket slung over a shoulder that was covered only by a thin, ragged tunic. The sentry looked at the clerk, then at the locked warehouse, and then spat into the mud before moving on. It was a look of utter defeated cynicism. But the clerk did not move. He stared at the wax seal. In his mind's eye, he saw the face of the drummer boy in the hospital. He saw the smug face of the chief of logistics warming his hands by the stove. A strange clarity descended upon him. The fear of the court-martial, the fear of the prison ship, the fear of the hangman's noose had all evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. He realized that to be a good soldier in the eyes of the Treasury, he had to let these men die. But to be a good man, he had to become a criminal. He reached into his pocket and touched the small brass key ring that held the keys to his own petty stores. None of them would fit this lock. He knew that. But he also knew where the keys to bonded store number 4 were kept. Muddy were conged. They were hanging on a hook behind the desk of the chief of logistics. He turned away from the warehouse, his boots squelching in the mud. He was not going back to his tent to write another futile letter. He was done with writing letters. He was done with begging. The wind howled off the Black Sea, carrying with it the smell of snow and death. The clerk pulled his collar up, his eyes narrowing against the gale. He walked with a new purpose now, a quick, determined stride that he had not possessed an hour ago. He was going to wage war, not against the Russians, but against the red tape that was strangling the army. Little did the Treasury know, as they tallied their accounts in London, that they had just created their most dangerous adversary. The clerk was about to commit his first act of high treason. He was going to steal the Queen's property to save the Queen's men. The sun had long since dipped below the ink-black horizon of the Black Sea, leaving the camp shrouded in a darkness so absolute it felt physical. The wind had dropped, but the cold had intensified, a razor-sharp frost that crept through the canvas walls of the tents and settled into the marrow of every living thing on the plateau. In the solitude of his workspace, the clerk sat before a flickering tallow candle. The rest of the administrative staff were asleep, wrapped in whatever warmth they could scavenge, but sleep was a luxury the clerk could no longer afford. Before him lay a pristine sheet of War Office vellum, a Form 108B, emergency requisition for divisional stores. It was a document of immense power, capable of unlocking the treasures of the bonded warehouses, provided it bore the signature of a general officer. The clerk did not have a general, but he did have a very steady hand, and a collection of correspondence from the divisional commander, Lord Raglan's chief of staff, littered across his desk. He studied the signature on a previous order. It was a sprawling, arrogant scrawl, the handwriting of a man who had never had to worry about the cost of ink. The clerk dipped his own pen, a humble steel nib, into the pot. He held it over the paper, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. This was the precipice. To write this name was to commit a felony. It was forgery. It was fraud. In the eyes of the Articles of War, it was a crime punishable by degradation, imprisonment, and, given the state of martial law, potentially death by firing squad. He thought of the sentry he had seen earlier, coughing blood into the snow. He thought of the warehouse full of greatcoats, guarded by nothing more than a padlock and a protocol. The pen touched the paper. There was no thunderclap, no sudden flash of lightning. There was only the dry scratching of steel on parchment. He replicated the loops and the heavy downstrokes of the general's hand with terrifying precision. He had spent a lifetime copying ledgers. His eye for detail, once the tool of his servitude, was now the instrument of his rebellion. He signed the name. Then he took a stick of red sealing wax, melted it over the candle flame, and pressed a counterfeit seal carved from a button into the hot, pooling wax. It was done. He held in his hand a lie that could save 1,000 lives, but the forgery was only the first step. The paper had to be converted into wool. He rose, donned his greatcoat, and stepped out into the frozen night. He made his way to the transport lines where the few remaining mules stood huddling together for warmth. He woke 2 drivers, men he knew, men he trusted not to ask questions. He told them simply that orders had come down and that a special night detail was required. The men, too cold to argue and too tired to care about the irregularity of the hour, hitched the mules to a flatbed wagon. The small convoy moved through the sleeping camp, the wheels crunching loudly on the frozen mud. To the clerk, the sound was deafening, a drum roll announcing his crime to the world. He expected at any moment to hear the challenge of the provost marshal, to see the lantern of an officer swinging in the dark. But the camp was a tomb. The cold had driven everyone underground. They arrived at bonded store number 4. The sentry on duty was a different man from the afternoon, a reservist from an Irish regiment who looked more dead than alive. He brought his musket to his shaky port-arms as the wagon approached. "Halt!" the sentry croaked. "Who goes there?" The clerk stepped into the light of the sentry's lantern. He did not cringe. He did not apologize. He drew himself up to his full height and produced the forged paper with a flourish of irritation. "Urgent dispatch from headquarters," the clerk snapped, adopting the clipped, impatient tone of the officer class he despised. "General Airy has ordered these stores moved to the front immediately, unless you wish to explain to the general why his orders were delayed." The sentry squinted at the paper. He saw the seal, he saw the signature, but more importantly, he saw the confidence in the clerk's eyes. It was the confidence of authority, the absolute certainty of the bureaucracy. The sentry was a peasant lad who had been trained to obey that tone of voice above all else. He lowered his musket. I don't have the key, sir," the sentry stammered. "I have the master," the clerk lied smoothly, producing a heavy iron key he had filed down from a spare during the previous week. He approached the lock. This was the moment of truth. If the key did not turn, the bluff would collapse. He inserted the iron into the mechanism. It met resistance. He forced it, feeling the metal bite, sweat breaking out on his forehead despite the freezing temperature. With a grinding clack, the tumblers gave way. The padlock fell open. The doors groaned as they were pulled back, revealing the cavernous interior. The smell that wafted out was intoxicating, the scent of lanolin, new leather, and dry wool. To the freezing men on the wagon, it smelled like life itself. "Load them up," the clerk whispered. "Quickly." The drivers did not need telling twice. They worked with a frantic energy, passing crates of boots and bales of blankets hand to hand. There was no inventory taken, no tally marks made in a book. For the first time in the history of the commissariat, supplies were leaving a warehouse without a paper trail. They filled the wagon until the axles groaned, covering the loot with a tarpaulin to disguise the nature of the cargo. The clerk locked the door behind them, the heavy click sealing his crime. He turned to the sentry, who was watching with wide, confused eyes. The clerk reached into the wagon, pulled out a single, thick woolen blanket, and tossed it to the man. "Compliments of the general," he said softly. "Keep warm, soldier." The sentry clutched the blanket to his chest, his eyes filling with sudden tears. He understood then. He nodded once. A silent pact of conspiracy formed in the darkness. He would see nothing. He would say nothing. The wagon began the slow, treacherous climb toward the divisional lines. It was a journey of only a mile or so to the nearest regiment. But in the pitch black, over rutted, frozen ground, it felt like an odyssey. When they arrived at the lines of the 95th Regiment, the camp was silent. The clerk found the sergeant major, a grizzled veteran who was awake, trying to keep a small fire alive with dried roots. The sergeant major looked at the wagon, then at the clerk. "What's this, then?" he growled. "We didn't order no officer's baggage." "It's not baggage," the clerk said, throwing back the tarpaulin. The sergeant major stared. He reached out a rough hand and touched the leather of a new boot. He looked at the clerk with a mixture of disbelief and suspicion. "Where did you get this?" The quartermaster general said there were no stocks. "The quartermaster general was mistaken," the clerk replied, his voice flat. "Get these distributed, now, before the sun comes up. And sergeant, this never happened. These men have always had these coats. Do you understand?" The sergeant major looked deep into the clerk's eyes. He saw the fatigue, the fear, and the steely resolve. He spat into the fire and grinned, a wolfish baring of teeth. "Understood, sir. God bless you." They woke the men in shifts. There were no cheers. Cheering would have alerted the officers. There was only a silent, bewildered shuffling as men stripped off their rotting rags and pulled on the thick, gray coats. They sat down to lace up stiff, new boots, weeping quietly as the feeling returned to their frozen feet. It was a scene of almost religious intensity, the communion of warmth. The clerk stood apart, watching. He felt no triumph, only a sick churning in his stomach. He had saved perhaps 200 men tonight, but there were 25,000 on the plateau. As he watched the wagon empty, he realized the terrifying arithmetic of his situation. The supplies he had stolen would be gone in a week. The boots would wear out. The blankets would get wet. And the winter was only just beginning. He had crossed the line. He was a criminal now. There was no going back to the safety of the ledger. If he stopped now, these men would die, and his sacrifice would be for nothing. To keep them alive, he would have to do this again, and again, and again. As the first gray light of dawn began to bleed into the eastern sky, the clerk walked back towards his tent. He passed the officers' mess where the morning bugle was just sounding. He knew that soon the auditors would come. They would notice the missing crates, they would check the serial numbers, the net would begin to close. Little did they know, the man they would be hunting was no longer just a clerk. In the darkness of the warehouse he had become a ghost. And the ghost was hungry for more. Crimes, like avalanches, possess a terrified momentum of their own. Once the first stone is dislodged, the slide becomes inevitable. For the clerk, the solitary act of forgery in the dead of night had been a desperate measure to save a single company of men. But as the sun rose over the bleak frozen expanse of the Chersonese plateau, the reality of his position became clear. He had not solved the problem, he had merely delayed the inevitable for a handful of souls. The 200 greatcoats he had stolen were but a drop in an ocean of freezing misery. 25,000 men still stood shivering in the wind, and the winter had only just begun to bare its teeth. To stop now would be to admit defeat, but to continue was to invite destruction. The clerk looked at his ledger, the spine broken and the pages dog-eared, and realized that petty theft would no longer suffice. He needed to industrialize his deception. He did not need a few crates, he needed a supply line. Thus began the Phantom Supply Line, an operation of logistical embezzlement so complex and audacious that it rivals any tactical maneuver executed by the generals on the field. The British Army's supply chain, such as it was, operated on a system of rigid hierarchy. When a supply ship docked in Balaclava, its cargo was designated by priority. At the top of the list were the officer comforts, the private consignments of wine, preserved meats, and fine linens destined for the tables of the headquarters staff. Below that came the ammunition. And at the very bottom, often left to rot on the quayside for want of transport, were the rations and clothing for the common infantry. The clerk's plan was simple in concept but terrifying in execution. He would invert the pyramid. He began by recruiting a conspiracy of the desperate. He found allies not in the officers' mess but in the mud. The drivers of the land transport corps, wretched men, often drunk, always frozen, who whipped their dying horses through the sludge, became his agents. He bought their loyalty not with gold, for gold was useless in a place where there was nothing to buy, but with rum and dry socks. A driver who agreed to lose a wagon or take a wrong turn was rewarded with a pint of spirits and a pair of stolen boots. In the economy of the Crimea, the clerk had become the richest man in the army. His method was a masterclass in bureaucratic camouflage. When a convoy of wagons was loaded with supplies for headquarters, the clerk would intercept the manifest. With a few deft strokes of his pen, case, wine, port, 12 count, became case, medical spirits, urgent. A consignment of officers' bedding was recoded as hospital blankets, general issue. He was not merely stealing, he was relabeling reality. The wagons, officially destined for the warm farmhouses where the generals slept, would be diverted at a crucial fork in the road. Instead of turning right towards headquarters, the drivers, guided by the clerk's silent hand, would turn left, plunging into the dark, rutted tracks that led to the front-line trenches. There, under the cover of fog or snow, the officers' comforts were unloaded into the hands of stunned sergeants who distributed the bounty to men who had not eaten a full meal in weeks. But the sheer scale of the operation meant that it could not remain a secret forever. By January of 1855, the discrepancies in the official accounts had grown too large to be ignored. The Treasury in London, alarmed by the reports of vanishing inventory, dispatched a team of auditors to the Crimea. These were not soldiers, they were forensic accountants in frock coats, men with eyes like flint and hearts of arithmetic. Their arrival brought a new, suffocating tension to the clerk's life. The enemy was no longer just the cold, it was Mr. Elias Thorne, a senior auditor known in the service as the Hangman of the Exchequer. Thorne was a man who could smell a missing shilling from a mile away. He set up his office in Balaclava and began to trawl through the paperwork, hunting for the leak. The clerk found himself in a deadly game of cat and mouse. Every day, Thorne would demand a new set of ledgers. Every night, the clerk would stay up until dawn, cooking the books to stay one step ahead. He created phantom regiments to account for the missing food. He invented accidental fires that had supposedly consumed piles of blankets. He forged storm damage reports, claiming that hundreds of boots had been washed out to sea. His ledger became a work of fiction, a novel of disasters that never happened, written to hide the disaster that was actually occurring. The climax of this shadow war came in mid-January, with the arrival of the Great Western Supply Train. This was not a train on rails. Those were still a dream of the future, but a massive convoy of 60 heavy wagons, the largest single movement of supplies the army had attempted. It carried the holy grail of the winter, prefabricated wooden huts that could save the army from freezing to death. Officially, these huts were allocated to the cavalry division and the general staff. The infantry in the trenches, the men actually fighting the Russians, were to remain in their tattered tents. The clerk saw the manifest, he saw the injustice, and he decided to hijack the entire convoy. The plan relied on a single, terrifying bluff. As the convoy marshaled in the town square of Balaclava, preparing to move out, the clerk rode out to meet it. He was wearing a borrowed greatcoat with the insignia of a staff officer, a capital offense in itself. He blocked the road, holding up a hand to halt the lead wagon. Thorne, the auditor, was watching from the balcony of the commissariat office, his suspicions aroused. He grabbed his telescope, training it on the scene below. The clerk addressed the wagon master, a burly civilian contractor. "Change of orders," the clerk shouted over the wind. "The cavalry lines are under quarantine. Typhus. You are to proceed immediately to the 2nd Division on the Crimean Heights." The wagon master hesitated. "I have my orders signed by Lord Raglan himself, sir," he grumbled. "And I have the plague reports," the clerk roared back, waving a piece of paper covered in meaningless medical jargon he had copied from a textbook. "Do you want your men to die of the black fever? Turn the wagons? Now!" It was a gamble of breathtaking audacity. If the wagon master asked to see the paper, the game was up. If Thorne came down from the balcony, the game was up. The clerk sat on his horse, his face a mask of furious authority, while his heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The mention of typhus was the masterstroke. Fear of disease was the only thing stronger than fear of rank. The wagon master paled. He signaled to his drivers. The whips cracked. The entire convoy, 60 wagons loaded with the life-saving timber huts, began to turn. They turned away from the aristocrats and towards the freezing grunt soldiers on the heights. Up on the balcony, Thorne lowered his telescope. He frowned. He knew something was wrong. The paperwork did not mention typhus. He grabbed his hat and cane, rushing down the stairs to intercept the convoy. But he was too late. By the time the auditor reached the muddy street, the rear of the last wagon was disappearing into the mist. The clerk had vanished into the crowd, slipping off the stolen coat and returning to the anonymity of the grey masses. That night, on the Crimean Heights, a miracle occurred. The wooden huts arrived. Men who had been sleeping in mud-filled holes found themselves under dry timber roofs. The sound of hammers echoed across the valley, a defiant music in the face of the Russian guns. However, back in the candlelit office, the victory felt hollow. The clerk sat before his ledger, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He had saved the division, but he had left a trail that even he could not hide. Thorne was not a fool. The typhus excuse would be checked against the medical returns. The lie would be exposed within 24 hours. The clerk looked at the rows of figures, the ink blurring before his tired eyes. He had built a phantom supply line, a ghost railway of goods that ran on deception and courage. But ghosts, by their nature, cannot exist in the light of day. The sun was rising on his deception. He opened the drawer of his desk and took out a small, heavy object. It was not a pistol, he was not a violent man, but a packet of personal letters from his wife in England. He placed them in his breast pocket. He knew that the knock on the door was coming. He had hijacked the Queen's wagons, forged the general's name, and humiliated the Treasury. Little did he know the knock would not come from the military police. It would come from someone far more dangerous, bearing an offer that would force him to choose between his safety and his soul. The phantom supply line had delivered its cargo, but the bill was about to come due. By the middle of January 1855, the war in the Crimea had bifurcated into two distinct conflicts. On the frozen heights of the Crimean Plateau, the British infantry fought a desperate, visceral battle against the Russians for possession of the trenches. But down in the muddy squalor of Balaclava, inside the drafty wooden shacks of the administration, a second war was raging, a silent, bloodless, yet equally lethal struggle between the clerk and the Treasury. This was the Battle of the Ledger. Mr. Elias Thorne, the senior auditor sent from London to root out maladministration, was a man who viewed the world as a series of double-entry columns. He possessed a mind like a steel trap and a heart seemingly constructed of dried parchment. To Thorne, a missing crate of biscuits was not a logistical error, it was a moral failing. He had spent the last week circling the clerk like a shark sensing blood in the water, sensing the vast, complex web of deceit that had been spun around the supply lines. The incident with the typhus convoy had been the breaking point. Thorne had checked the medical returns. There was no typhus in the cavalry lines. The deception was patent. He knew that the clerk was responsible, but he lacked the physical proof, the paper trail, to drag him before a court-martial. So, on the morning of January the 20th, Thorn decided to launch a direct assault. He did not come with soldiers. He came with a team of junior clerks armed with inkwells and blank audit forms. They marched into the clerk's workspace, a cramped, candlelit tent that smelled of damp wool and anxiety, and effectively laid siege to his desk. "We are here," Thorn announced, his voice dry as dust, "to conduct a comprehensive audit of all consumable stores issued since October 1st. You will produce your books, Quartermaster, every page, every receipt, every counterfoil." It was a sentence of death. The clerk knew that his ledgers were a work of fiction. If Thorn examined them closely, he would find that the same 200 blankets had been issued to 3 different regiments simultaneously. He would find signatures that didn't match. He would find the ghost inventory. But the clerk had anticipated this moment. He knew he could not hide the truth forever. His strategy, therefore, was not concealment, but obfuscation. If he could not win the war, he would flood the battlefield with so much bureaucratic fog that the enemy would lose their way. He stood up, bowed stiffly, and gestured to the wall of wooden filing cabinets behind him. "The Crown's records are at your disposal, Mr. Thorn," he said with a politeness that bordered on insolence. "However, I must warn you, the filing system is complex." Thorn sneered and opened the first ledger. What followed was a masterclass in the weaponization of red tape. The clerk had spent the previous nights dismantling the logical order of his files. He had cross-referenced simple requisitions with obscure, archaic regulations dating back to the Napoleonic Wars. When Thorn demanded to know why 50 barrels of salt pork were missing, the clerk did not panic. He calmly produced a Form 17 Alpha, a document he had largely invented, which claimed the pork had been condemned as unfit for human consumption under the Pure Food Statutes of 1842 and transferred to a holding account for biological hazard. "Show me the condemnation order," Thorn demanded. "I am afraid that is filed under the Veterinary Department's returns, sir," the clerk replied smoothly, "which, as you know, requires a separate written request to access, as per the Commander-in-Chief's standing order regarding interdepartmental privacy." Thorn ground his teeth. He was a creature of rules, and the clerk was using the rules to strangle him. For 3 days, the audit dragged on. It was a grind of attrition. Thorn would find a discrepancy. The clerk would bury it in an avalanche of cross-references, pending inquiries, and awaiting confirmation stamps. The office became a theater of the absurd. The clerk was polite, helpful, and utterly obstructing. He was filibustering the Treasury. But while this dance of paper was happening, the clerk was executing a final, desperate maneuver in the background. The issue was lime juice. Scurvy had begun to ravage the army. It is a terrible, degrading disease. Old wounds reopen, gums bleed, and men simply fade away from exhaustion. The cure, fresh lime juice, was sitting in the hold of a ship in the harbor. The Commissariat had refused to unload it because the barrels were not of the standard regulation size, and thus could not be properly inventoried. While Thorn was distracted hunting for the missing salt pork, the clerk was surreptitiously filling out the release forms for the lime juice. He was signing them right under the auditor's nose, slipping them into the stack of papers Thorn had already checked, effectively tricking the auditor into approving them by association. The tension in the tent was palpable. The air was thick with the scratch of pens and the unspoken knowledge that one of these men was going to destroy the other. "Here!" Thorn suddenly shouted, slamming his hand down on a page. "Explain this, sir. A requisition for 1,000 pairs of boots for the 93rd Highlanders, signed by Colonel Ainsworth." The clerk froze. This was a dangerous one. He had forged Ainsworth's signature 2 weeks ago. "The 93rd received those boots, sir," the clerk said quietly. "I have spoken to Colonel Ainsworth this morning," Thorn said, a triumphant gleam in his eye. "He is in the hospital. He has been delirious with fever for a month. He could not have signed this." The room went silent. The junior clerk stopped writing. The wind howled outside, a lonely, mournful sound. Thorn had found the crack in the armor. "This is a forgery," Thorn whispered, the accusation hanging in the air like smoke. "You have falsified a signature of a field officer. That is a capital crime." The clerk looked at the ledger. He looked at Thorn. He could have denied it. He could have claimed it was a mistake, a clerical error, but he was tired. He was so incredibly tired of the lies. "The boots were issued," the clerk said, his voice steady. "I saw them on the men's feet. They were marching. They were alive." "That is irrelevant," Thorn snapped. "The process was violated. The integrity of the supply chain is the only thing that separates an army from a rabble. You have stolen the Queen's property." "I have used the Queen's property to keep her soldiers from freezing," the clerk retorted, his composure finally cracking. "Do you know what is happening up there, Mr. Thorn? Have you left this office? Men are eating their own leather straps. They are sleeping in water. And you are worried about a signature?" "I am worried about the law," Thorn roared. and you are under arrest." He reached for the bell on the desk to summon the provost marshal. "Wait," the clerk said. It was not a plea, it was a command. Thorn paused, his hand hovering over the bell. "You can arrest me," the clerk said, reaching into his drawer and pulling out a sheaf of papers. "You can hang me, but if you ring that bell, you will never find the lime juice." Thorn frowned. "What? The lime juice?" the clerk repeated. "The cure for the scurvy that is killing 50 men a day. I have arranged for its transport. The wagons are loading now. The paperwork is complicated. It relies on a specific set of cross-authorizations that only I understand. If I am arrested, the chain breaks. The juice sits on the wharf. The men die." He pushed the papers across the desk. They were a chaotic mess of authorizations, some real, some fake, a puzzle that only the clerk could solve. "Arrest me now," the clerk said softly, "and you explain to the London Times why you let the army rot when the cure was within reach. Or you let me finish this shipment, you let me get the juice to the front, and then I will surrender to you." It was the ultimate gamble. He was holding the lives of the soldiers hostage to buy himself a few more hours of freedom. He was betting on the fact that Thorn, for all his bureaucratic coldness, was still a human being who did not want to be responsible for a massacre. Thorn stared at the clerk. He looked at the bell. He looked at the papers. For a long, agonizing minute, the only sound was the sputtering of the candle. Thorn was wrestling with the impossible logic of the situation. To uphold the law, he had to allow death to save lives. He had to condone a crime. Slowly, very slowly, Thorn pulled his hand back from the bell. "You have until sunset," Thorn hissed, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. "Get the juice to the lines, but tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock I will have the provost marshal here, and I will see you in irons." The clerk nodded. "Thank you." Thorn stormed out of the tent, unable to look at the man who had just outmaneuvered him. The clerk was left alone in the silence. He slumped back in his chair, the adrenaline draining away, leaving him shaking. He had won the battle, but he had lost the war. He spent the rest of the day orchestrating the movement of the lime juice. He watched the barrels roll away on the wagons, bright green casks that held the promise of health. He felt a profound sense of peace. He had done it. He had emptied the warehouses. He had cheated the treasury of its hoarding. But as the sun began to set, casting long, blood-red shadows across the snow, the clerk turned back to his desk for the final time. He had one last task to perform. He had to tidy the books. He began to organize the proofs of his own guilt, stacking the forged requisitions in a neat pile, ready for the prosecution. He was arranging the papers when his hand brushed against a document at the bottom of the stack. It was the original order for the typhus convoy, the one he had hijacked. He looked at it closely for the first time in weeks, and his blood ran cold. He had always assumed that Thorn suspected him based on the medical returns, but as he looked at the document, he saw something he had missed in the darkness of that night. On the back of the requisition, scrawled in faint pencil, was a countersign. It wasn't a forgery. It was a witness mark. Someone else had signed off on the wagons leaving. Someone high up. The clerk realized with a jolt of electric shock that he wasn't the only one playing a game. Thorn hadn't just caught him. Thorn had been holding back a piece of evidence that implicated someone far more powerful than a humble quartermaster. The clerk wasn't just a thief, he was a scapegoat. The system wasn't just incompetent, it was conspiring to cover its own tracks, and he was the perfect victim to take the fall. He looked at the setting sun. The provost marshal was coming at 8. The noose was ready. But the clerk suddenly realized that the ledger held one final secret, a secret that could either save him or bring the entire government crashing down. The night of January the 20th was the longest of the clerk's life. It was a silence punctuated only by the scratching of the wind against the canvas and the rhythmic thumping of his own heart. He sat at his desk, the instrument of his crimes, the ledger lying closed before him. He was a man waiting for the axe to fall, yet in this final abyss of anxiety, his mind possessed a strange, crystalline clarity. He picked up the document he had unearthed earlier, the requisition for the typhus convoy. He held it close to the flickering candle, examining the faint pencil mark on the reverse side. It was an initial. A single jagged letter, scrawled with a haste that betrayed panic. The clerk knew that hand. He had seen it on a dozen official proclamations. It belonged to General Airy, the quartermaster general himself. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The general had seen the convoy leaving. He had seen the clerk blocking the road. He had known in that instant that the regulations were being broken. But he had not stopped it. Instead, he had made this small, deniable mark a silent authorization. The truth washed over the clerk, cold and bitter. He was not a rogue agent outsmarting the system. He was the system's useful idiot. The high command knew the army was dying. They knew the Treasury rules were murderous, but they lacked the moral courage to break them openly, for fear of losing their pensions or their social standing. So they had watched the clerk do it for them. If he succeeded, the army lived. If he failed, or if the auditors came calling, he was the perfect, low-ranking scapegoat to hang for the crime. He had been playing a game of chess against the devil, only to realize he was merely a pawn on the devil's board. The dawn broke not with the golden promise of the sun, but with the gray, weeping mist common to the Crimean coast. At 8 o'clock precisely, the heavy tread of boots squelched in the mud outside. The tent flap was thrown back. Mr. Elias Thorne stood there. Behind him stood the provost marshal and 2 soldiers with fixed bayonets. "Time is up, Quartermaster," Thorne said. His voice was devoid of triumph. It was merely the sound of a machine completing a cycle. The clerk stood up. He smoothed his tunic, buttoning it to the neck. He picked up his cap. He did not look at the soldiers. He looked at Thorne. "The lime juice?" the clerk asked. "Delivered," Thorne replied curtly. "The surgeons are administering it now. You have saved them from scurvy, sir. But you could not save yourself from the law." The arrest was conducted with a terrifying formality. The provost marshal stepped forward and demanded the clerk's sword, a ceremonial piece he had never drawn in anger. He handed it over. Then he was marched out of the tent. The walk to the guardhouse was intended to be a walk of shame. It was a ritual of humiliation designed to show the rank and file what happens to those who defy the crown. They marched him down the main thoroughfare of Balaclava, past the warehouses he had looted, past the office where he had forged the signatures. But as the procession moved through the mud, a strange phenomenon occurred. The camp was awake. The soldiers of the 93rd Highlanders and the Rifle Brigade were mustering for the morning fatigue parties. They saw the prisoner, they saw the bayonets, and they understood. They did not jeer. They did not look away. As the clerk passed, the soldiers stopped their work. They stood to attention. One by one, veterans with beards matted with ice, men who had stormed the Alma and held the line at Inkerman, raised their hands in a salute. It was not a crisp, parade ground salute. It was slow, somber, and deeply respectful. It was the salute of men acknowledging a savior. Thorne, walking ahead, stiffened. He heard the silence. He felt the weight of 1,000 eyes boring into his back. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that the law and justice were not the same thing. He was arresting a criminal, but the army was honoring a hero. They arrived at the tribunal tent. It was not a full court-martial that would take weeks to convene, but a preliminary board of inquiry. 3 officers sat behind a trestle table, a colonel of the guards, a major of the cavalry, and Thorne himself as the prosecutor. The proceedings were brutal and short. Thorne laid out the evidence. The forged signatures, the hijacked wagons, the missing inventory. The numbers were damning. The accused, Thorne concluded, has engaged in a systematic embezzlement of His Majesty's stores. He has subverted the chain of command and acted with a reckless disregard for authority. The crown rests. The colonel looked at the clerk. "Do you have anything to say in your defense, Quartermaster? Do you deny these charges?" The clerk stood alone in the center of the tent. He looked at the officers. He saw the general's initial in his mind's eye. He knew that if he spoke about the conspiracy, if he dragged the general into this, he would disappear. Accidents happen in war. A man who knows too much often finds himself on a dangerous patrol from which he does not return. He had to accept the fall. "I do not deny the acts, sir," the clerk said quietly. "I deny only the intent. Explain," the colonel barked. "I found the regulations to be incompatible with life," the clerk said, his voice gaining strength. "A ledger cannot bleed, sir, but men can. I traded ink for blood. If that is a crime, then I am guilty. But I would ask the court to look at the 4th Division. Look at their feet. They are wearing the boots I stole. Look at their backs. They are wearing the coats I forged. If I am to hang, let me. Hang knowing that they are warm." The room went silent. The major of cavalry looked down at his hands. Even the colonel, a man of iron discipline, seemed to shift uncomfortably in his chair. The moral weight of the argument was crushing. But the army runs on discipline, not morality. The verdict was delivered after a recess of only 10 minutes. The colonel returned, refusing to meet the clerk's eyes. "It is the finding of this board," the colonel announced, "that you are guilty of gross misconduct and insubordination." However, he paused, glancing at a note that had been slipped to him during the break, a note, perhaps, from a nervous general who wanted this problem to go away quietly. "In light of the mitigating circumstances and your previous good character, the board has decided not to pursue a capital sentence." The clerk let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. "You are hereby relieved of your duties effective immediately," the colonel continued. "You are stripped of your rank. You will be placed on the first ship returning to England. You are dismissed the service with ignominy. You will receive no pension. You will never hold a government position again. Get him out of my sight." It was a destruction of a different kind. He was not to be a martyr. He was to be a failure. He was to be erased. The clerk was escorted back to his tent to collect his few personal belongings. He packed his bag in silence. He took the packet of letters from his wife. He took a single empty inkwell as a memento. He left the ledger on the desk. As he walked down to the harbor, the sun finally broke through the clouds. It was late February now. The air felt different. There was a softness in the breeze, the first whisper of spring. The ice on the road was turning to slush. He walked past the hospital. The sounds of coughing had diminished. The men were recovering. The lime juice was working. The huts were up. The army had survived the winter. He reached the gangplank of the transport ship, the Himalaya. It was a ship filled with the wounded and the broken, men returning home to a country that would celebrate them as heroes. The clerk walked among them, a civilian in a soiled coat, invisible once more. As the ship pulled away from the dock, the clerk stood at the stern rail. He watched the coast of the Crimea recede. He saw the white cliffs of Balaclava, the mud of the camps, and the distant smoke of the siege guns. He had arrived as a small cog in a great machine. He was leaving as a broken part, discarded on the scrap heap. He had won the battle against the cold, but the victory belonged to others. The generals would get the medals, the soldiers would get the glory, he would get poverty and obscurity, but as the shoreline vanished into the mist, a soldier on crutches hobbled up to the rail beside him. It was the sentry from the warehouse, the man he had given the first blanket to, months ago. The soldier looked at the clerk. He didn't say a word. He simply reached into his pocket, pulled out a piece of hardtack biscuit, the gold dust of the front line, and broke it in half. He handed one half to the clerk. It was a communion of survivors. The clerk took the biscuit. He looked at the soldier, and for the first time in months he smiled. A genuine, tired smile. He realized then that he didn't need a medal. He had the ledger. And in the secret, silent accounting of his own conscience, the numbers finally balanced. Little did he know, his story was not quite over. The ship that carried him home was also carrying a report that would explode in London like a bomb, triggering a scandal that would vindicate him and change the British Army forever. The return of the clerk to the shores of England was not marked by the fanfare that greeted the returning regiments. There were no bands playing "See the Conquering Hero Comes," no weeping mothers throwing flowers, no speeches from the Lord Mayor on the steps of the Guildhall. He disembarked at Southampton on a grey Tuesday, his coat threadbare, his pockets empty, and his name already dissolving from the official memory of the War Office. He melted back into the anonymity of civilian life, a man who had held the fate of an army in his hands, now reduced to counting sacks of flour for a merchant in the city of London. He walked the foggy streets of the capital, listening to the newsboys shouting about the fall of Sevastopol, about the glory of the empire, knowing that the true story of how that victory was bought lay buried in a locked drawer in Balaclava. But history, unlike the Treasury, has a way of balancing its books eventually. While the clerk sat in obscurity, a storm was brewing in Westminster. The reports from the Crimea, the harrowing dispatches sent by William Howard Russell to the Times, had set the public imagination ablaze. The British people, horrified by the tales of freezing soldiers and rotting horses, demanded answers. They did not want to know about flank movements or cavalry charges. They wanted to know why their sons had died for want of a blanket. The government of Lord Aberdeen fell, crushed by the weight of its own incompetence. And in the wake of the scandal, a commission of inquiry was launched. Sir John McNeill and Colonel Tulloch were sent to the Crimea to exhume the truth. Their report, published in 1856, was a bombshell that shattered the complacent silence of the Victorian establishment. It was a document of forensic brutality. It laid bare the stupidity of the delay, the criminal negligence of the supply chain, and the insanity of the red tape. And buried deep within the appendices of that report, like a diamond in a coal seam, was the vindication of our clerk. The commissioners noted the irregularities in the supply of the 4th Division. They noted the inexplicable arrival of boots and coats during the worst weeks of the winter. They traced the phantom supply lines. But instead of condemning these actions as crimes, the report held them up as miracles. It appears, the report stated in dry official prose, that had the strict letter of the regulations been followed, the entire division would have perished. It was only through the unauthorized initiative of certain officers that a catastrophe was averted. Unauthorized initiative that transformed treason into heroism. The clerk read these words in a morning newspaper, sitting in a crowded coffee house. He did not cheer. He simply folded the paper, placed it in his pocket, and finished his tea. It was enough. The verdict of his peers did not matter. The verdict of the facts had been delivered. The legacy of the clerk, however, went far beyond a few lines in a report. His rebellion was the spark that burned down the old, rotten structure of the British military administration. The disaster in the Crimea taught the Empire a lesson it would never forget, that logistics is not a servant of war, but its master. From the ashes of the Commissariat rose a new understanding. The Land Transport Corps was reformed. The military train was established. Decades later, these reforms would crystallize into the Royal Army Service Corps, a professional body of soldier logisticians dedicated to the principle that no soldier should ever again fight on an empty stomach. Every time a British soldier in the First or Second World War received a hot meal in a trench or a pair of dry socks on a muddy front, they were the unknowing beneficiaries of the battle fought by the lonely clerk in 1854. He had proved that the pen, when wielded with moral courage, is mightier than the sword. He had demonstrated that the true measure of a soldier is not how many lives he can take, but how many he can save. Our protagonist lived out the rest of his days in quiet dignity. He never sought reinstatement. He never wrote a memoir. When he died, years later, his funeral was a small affair. There were no gun salutes, no flag draped over the coffin. But it is said that every year, on the anniversary of the Great Hurricane, a single wreath would appear on his grave. It bore no name, no card. It was simply a wreath of laurel leaves bound together not with ribbon but with a strip of old gray wool. The same rough wool of a Crimean gray coat. A silent tribute from the men who remembered. Today, if you walk through London, you will see statues of Lord Raglan, of Cardigan, of the great generals who sat on their horses while their men died. They are cast in bronze, staring imperiously over the city. But there is no statue of the clerk. He does not need one. His monument is not made of stone. It is written in the survival of the British Army. It is written in the lesson that efficiency without humanity is a sin. It is written in the ledgers of history, which, if you look closely enough, tell the story of a man who defeated the greatest army in the world, not the Russians, but the army of bureaucracy without firing a single shot. He was the paperwork warrior. The man who forged a signature to save a soul, and in the final accounting of the human spirit, his balance sheet stands immaculate. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the forgotten shadows of the past. If this story has moved you, if you believe that the heroes of the ledger deserve to be remembered alongside the heroes of the sword, please subscribe to the channel and share this video. Help us keep the ink fresh on their stories. Until next time, remember, history is not just what is written, it is what is survived.